Amen. You guys grab a seat if you haven't already. And I want to encourage you to open a Bible if you have one. I hope you do. If you don't, if you have a cell phone or something, so you can follow along with a passage of Scripture today that I find to be quite powerful. One of my favorite books of the Bible. I've preached it a couple times and find a lot of challenge and a lot of encouragement in is the book of Hebrews. And that's where we're going to be today. The book of Hebrews, chapter 11. And that's where we're going to be today. What an appropriate song for us to sing today as we're preparing for the fifth reality of experiencing God, or our journey towards what it means to experience God. And we've been on this journey asking the question, what is God's will and how do we align our lives to it? We've been asking that question with the hope and the desire and the prayer that we would experience God in a way maybe that we have before and it's been a while, or maybe experience God in a way that we haven't yet experienced in our Christian life, or maybe experience God for the first time because we've never really truly given our hearts and our lives to Jesus. And so it's a journey towards experiencing God in a personal and transformational way, to know God for who He is and to be transformed by knowing Him in that way. And today, the question we're faced with is, I think, a serious question. Is this whole journey towards experiencing God, towards knowing God's will and finding God's will and pursuing God's will, is this journey worth it? Is it worth it? Is it worth it to endeavor to know God's will and to pursue it with your life? Is it worth it? I think that's the question that this fifth reality really is asking. The fifth reality of experiencing God is God's invitation for you to work with Him always leads to a crisis of belief that requires faith and action. I thought I put that on the screen, but I maybe not have. God's invitation for you to work with Him always leads to a crisis of belief that requires faith and action. When Blackaby is saying that, he's not talking about a traumatic event that causes you to question your faith in God. Sometimes we have those crisis of belief moments, right? Where maybe someone we love dies or something bad happens in our lives. And so we're faced with this crisis of belief where it's like, do I really believe God to be good? That's one of the most popular questions in our world, is not whether or not God exists, but whether God is good. If God does exist, is He good? And I think many of us ask that question in our lives. And that's not necessarily what this crisis of faith, this crisis of belief that Blackaby is talking about. It's not necessarily what he's talking about. It is an important question. Do we really believe this? But rather, this crisis it's rather an ongoing process of continually giving ourselves over to God's plan for our lives by trusting Him. It's like, are you willing to wade deeper into the waters of what Jesus is calling us to? Are we willing to give up certain things about our lives and pursue His will over our own will? That's really the crisis of faith that we're talking about today. And faith really is at the root of the question. Is it worth it to trust God, to embrace a kind of faith that pushes us beyond what we find comfortable, safe, and secure? And faith is the fuel that drives our willingness to give ourselves over to the Lord's plans and purposes in our lives. The thing that's going to be the fuel, the catalyst, if you will, for you to say, yes, I want to give myself fully and completely to God, is faith. Do you believe Him? Do you trust Him? And one of the chapters of the Bible where faith is explained most clearly and profoundly than really any other chapter of the Bible, maybe most extensively, is in Hebrews chapter 11. It is known as the Hall of Faith, or the faith chapter, if you will. And we get a definition of faith in those first two verses. He does two things really in chapter 11. He gives us a definition of faith, and then he also gives us many examples of faith lived out. But in Hebrews 1 and 2, or 11, 1 and 2, we get this definition of faith. And you've heard it before. It's not a new definition for you. It says, now faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen. For by this our ancestors were approved. And that's sort of his transitional verse to talk about our ancestors. He's talking about not your ancestors from, a couple hundred years ago, but your ancestors from a couple of thousand of years ago, and even more so with Noah and with Adam and Eve and with Abraham and those patriarchs that we read about in the Old Testament. That's his focus. But he begins by looking at the definition of faith. Now, faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen. And that in and of itself is a pretty powerful definition. But if you understand, and see, this is sometimes why reading the English translation of the Bible we have to dive a little bit deeper, because if you understand the words there, you actually start to get a better picture of what these words actually mean. And the word reality there is not the same kind of word that you would think of as like virtual reality, like you're seeing something that looks real but it's not really real. What he means, what the author of Hebrews is writing there, it's this legal right to possess something with certainty. It's so what he's saying is, now faith is the legal right for you to own something, for you to possess something that you have not yet seen. Does that make sense? Like, that's powerful, isn't it? Because faith is not just this kind of arbitrary thing, this idea of that faith is this sort of hoping that something will come true or something will be true if we hope hard enough, or we really hope that this is the reality. But rather, this faith is this legal right to something, legal right to possess something that we haven't really even seen yet. It's the reality of what is hoped for. And that word hoped is expected. It's another translation. You can translate it to be expected. So reality of what is hoped for, what is expected. And so faith is guaranteed certainty that what is expected will come to pass. Faith, it gives texture and substance to something that has not yet been or we have not yet experienced or seen or touched in reality. That's the sort of the direction of what the author of Hebrews is trying to get us to understand, is this faith that we're pursuing is this like really tangible thing that you may never touch or feel, but it's real and it's something for us to pursue. And he doesn't stop there. He says, and that faith can be seen in the real life stories of the heroes of the faith listed. And so he begins to tell the stories of those that have gone before us. He begins with creation, and he goes to Cain and Abel, and then he goes to Enoch, this obscure figure in the Old Testament who we don't really know a lot about, but we know that he never experienced death. He was just brought up into heaven. He tells us about Noah. He tells us about Abraham and Sarah. And in the continuing passages later on, he goes into more about Abraham and Isaac and Moses, and then he talks about, mentions in real quick order, a group of others. And as I was thinking and praying about this passage over the last couple weeks, I had the opportunity last week. Pam and I spent our fall break, and the girls, we spent our fall break in Fargo, North Dakota, where we moved here from 6.5 years ago. And this past weekend was the retirement of someone who really is a hero of the faith for me. A pastor that has had a huge influence and been a huge encouragement to me in ministry for some time. His name is Pastor Durward Garrett, but everybody calls him Pastor Dude. No joke. Like, it's not disrespectful. It's his name. I met Pastor Dude 16 years ago on my very first trip to Fargo. We didn't realize this when we were there last week, but my first trip to Fargo was October the 13th. We left Nashville October the 13th of 2007. The day before I left for Fargo, I asked Pam to marry me in Centennial Park in Nashville, and then I got on an airplane, and when I came back 4 days later, I said, hey, you remember I asked you to marry me, girl from Florida? Hey, we're going to move to Fargo and start churches. That actually happened. But it was last week we celebrated the 16 years ago that we came to Fargo for the first time. And Pastor Dude had been the pastor of Temple Baptist Church since the late 1980s. He's been in North Dakota since the early 1980s, since I was born, basically. And he pastored Temple Baptist, one of the oldest Southern Baptist churches in the Dakotas. And at the time, it was one of the largest Southern Baptist churches in the Dakotas. They only had about 60 or 70 people that would show up on Sunday morning, but it was one of the largest Southern Baptist churches in the Dakotas. We were on a scouting trip. We were praying about potentially coming to Fargo to start a church. And Pastor Dude was there to talk about Fargo and meet these new church planters. And in the first few minutes of getting to know him, he tried to talk us out of coming to Fargo. At least that's what it seemed like. It seemed like it was kind of like, well, this guy doesn't want us to come here at all. He's telling us all bad things about it. The reality is that's not what Pastor Dude was doing. He was telling us about the reality of ministry in Fargo, the reality of ministry in the Dakotas. And it's hard and it's difficult. I've been reflecting on that idea for the last 5, 6, 7 days. Really, even while I was there. Until today, most of you probably have never heard the name Derwin Garrett. And those who have, only because I've shared it with you before. None of you have likely met Pastor Dude. If you have, that'd be awesome. I'd love to meet you and talk to you about Pastor Dude, because I didn't know anybody else knew him. The church he pastored for over 30 years really never grew much over 100 people on Sunday mornings. He never spoke at conferences really outside of the Dakotas, and he never wrote any books, although he probably would write a good book. And if you look at his ministry, it might seem like that 30 plus years in Fargo and 40 years in ministry didn't really matter much, that it really wasn't all that worth it. He could have had a more successful ministry somewhere else. He could have done, more at a different occupation potentially. But what struck me so profoundly about this weekend, and I was struck to tears multiple times, was how God blesses the faith and the obedience of his people. At some time in his life, in his early 20s and late teens potentially, Pastor Dude had a crisis of belief. He had to make a decision whether he was going to give his life towards ministering to God's people, to pastoring God's people, or whether he was going to pursue something different. He had to make a decision at some point in late into his seminary career whether he was going to go to a place like Devil's Lake, North Dakota. Anybody ever been to Devil's Lake, North Dakota? Some of you might have been. It's good fishing there. But he had to make a decision. Am I going to go to Devil's Lake, North Dakota and pastor a church? And that was a crisis of belief moment for him. And 6 years later, he had to make a decision. Okay, this city, Fargo, is the hub of everything in North Dakota for the most part. And there's an opportunity for me to pastor a church in Fargo, North Dakota, one of the oldest churches in the state. And he had a crisis of belief. Am I going to go there? He never made a lot of money. He never got a lot of prestige for the things that he did. But Pastor Dude, what struck me is his faith and his obedience over the years. Pastor Dude was quick to tell us last week that he's nothing special. Like that the Lord the Lord, there's a lot of people that would come up and say good things about him, but there's this equal number of people that would say a lot of bad things about him. And I appreciate his humility there. But Pastor Dude has preached to hundreds or thousands of people over his ministry career. He's helped start a Christian counseling center that counsels people across the state of North Dakota. He has pastored baseball players as a baseball chaplain for the local FM Redhawks. He's pastored missionaries, families going through really tough trials. He's pastored college students trying to figure out what to do with their lives and whether God is real or not. He's pastored pastors like myself who needed someone to encourage them and to believe in them. There's been those moments sitting across the breakfast table with tears running down my face saying, I don't know if I can keep doing this. And Pastor Dude looking at me and saying, Jeremy, what you're doing matters. What you're doing is valuable. His faith and his obedience was contagious as well. I talk about him like he's dead. He's still there and he's still going to be ministering to the Lord. But when I think about the hall of fame of godly servants and leaders in my life, Pastor Dude is definitely on that list. And what makes Pastor Dude so influential is his faith and his obedience to God and his word. And the author of Hebrews is describing biblical faith using the examples of the heroes of the Old Testament as examples of such faith. And he does this in order to call us to such a faith. He spends the entirety of chapter 11. He defines it. He shows us examples of faith lived out. And then listen to Hebrews chapter 12, 1 and 2. He says, therefore, and we know anytime there's a therefore, we got to ask the question, what's the therefore, right? Well, the therefore is pointing back to all those that he's just talked about in Hebrews chapter 11. He says, therefore, since you have such a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, since we have this great heritage of faith lived out that has gone before us, let us lay aside every hindrance and the sin that so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance the race that's set before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy that lay before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. The author of Hebrews is calling us to live out a real faith. At that crisis of belief moment, to choose pursuit of Jesus over the pursuit of anything else. Regardless of what your life circumstances are. It's not everybody's going to be a pastor of a church in North Dakota or the pastor of a church in Kentucky. That's not what he's calling. But he's saying, how are you in the calling and the direction that God is calling you to in your life? How are you going to exemplify and live out and pursue that kind of faith? Unhindered, unrestrained, unwavering, unashamed pursuit of joy in and obedience to Jesus. That's the faith. That's the faith, living by example, looking to the cloud of witnesses that have gone before us. And so as we look at this chapter, what I've found in this chapter are streams. These threads, if you will, of common, the commonality marked by the faith journey of those heroes that has gone before us. And I think throughout the chapter, what we see is in these four threads that are highlighted by the writer of Hebrews. And I want to just point those out to you as we walk through them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the individual people. We'll mention them, but I want to point out the threads that are common in each one of their lives that I think give us principles for us to look at for our own lives. Here's the first thread. We see it in chapter 11, verse 6. Each experienced God in a personal and transformational way. Listen to verse 6. It says, now without faith it is impossible to please God, since the one who draws near must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Faith, the kind of faith that we read about in these men and women in chapter 11 of Hebrews is a faith that comes out of an experience with God. We've been talking about that now for weeks, and Andy last week talked about how God speaks to us. And he did a great job of talking about how God doesn't speak to us in burning bush moments. He doesn't necessarily speak to us. It's how he spoke to Moses. It's how he spoke to many of the prophets, and these experiences, his voice coming out of something, right? But now God speaks through his word and through his people. But with this faith, God speaks, God reveals, and when he does, it always leads to a crisis of faith. Will we trust him? Will we follow him? If you trace each of the stories of those mentioned in chapter 11, and though we might not have the detailed stories of Enoch and some others, there's clear evidence that each of them encountered and experienced God in a real and personal way that confronted them with a decision. Will they trust him, listen to him, believe him? Will they obey and follow him? From the very beginning, Abel and Cain were the sons of Adam and Eve, and they are called by God. They are given these certain requirements or these certain tasks, if you will. Abel is to raise livestock, and Cain is to be a farmer. And Abel's faith, God calls them to give an offering, and Abel's faith led him to offer God the best of his flock, trusting that God would provide for him. Can you imagine, like, maybe that's the first crop that's ever been harvested by anybody? The first flock of lambs or whatever it is that Abel raised would be the first one that's ever raised by anyone. You can imagine that Cain is sitting there looking at his crop saying, I know I need to give some of this to God, but what am I going to take care of? How am I going to take care of myself? And Abel looks at the flock, and his response is not that, but rather it's, look at what God has given me. And so I'll give him back the best. There's a trust that God would provide for him. God told Noah to build an ark. Crazy, unbelievable mission, but Noah's faith led him to trust God and do something that made no worldly sense. Everybody laughed at him. Everybody made fun of him. Abraham was told by God to pack up his family and move without knowing where he would go, with a promise that seemed incredibly unlikely to happen. But Abraham's faith led him to believe God would do what he said he would do. Each of these, and we can continue to go through them, each of these were given a choice or choices to trust God or to doubt his word. They were confronted with this. God's word came to them and said, this is what I want you to do. And they had an opportunity at that moment to trust him or not. And though none were perfect, as you can see through the whole of their story, each showed moments of profound faith in God and his word that led them to obedience. But it also led them to struggle, and that's the second thread I want to point out. Their faith decision or decisions led to struggle and suffering. Don't get it in your head that the author of Hebrews is somehow presenting the idea that biblical faith and obedience will steer us away from pain, struggle, suffering, and persecution. Hebrews 11:36-38 says, others experienced mocking and scourging, as well as bonds and imprisonment, and were stoned. They were sawed in two. They died by the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and on mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. Following God isn't easy. Will often lead to people turning their backs on you, financial struggles, moments and seasons of despair, loneliness, confusion, frustration, brokenness, anger, persecution, bitterness, and so many other things. We as human beings run from these things with everything we have, don't we? I mean, we want to avoid suffering at all costs. Whatever it costs, we want to avoid suffering. We want to steer around any kind of struggle in life, believing somehow we've earned the right to avoid hard things, believing that God would never lead us to a place of struggle or suffering, and that just is a promise God never promised. The Israelites were enslaved in Egypt in order for God to save them. When Moses entered the picture, the people of Israel had been in slavery for hundreds of years. And when Moses led them out of Israel, it wasn't like he led them to a 5-star resort, right? He led them to the wilderness. And they stayed in the wilderness because they didn't believe in God. But even when they got to the promised land, it wasn't like, okay, now we can rest. No, they had to fight. Read the book of Joshua, the conqueror. And really throughout the rest of the Old Testament, there was a fight. God led them towards struggle. Gideon was called to lead the people from the grasp of the Midianites. If you read the story of Gideon, you would say, oh, well, Gideon, man, he had so much success. But they were oppressed by a people, the Midianites. And when God found Gideon, he was in a hole, smashing grapes in a hole because he was afraid the Midianites were going to come and take him out and steal all of their stuff. And when he called Gideon, he didn't call him to this huge army. Rather, he dwindled his army from thousands down to 300. See, that's the thing that we get in our brains is, okay, well, if I do these things, then my life will be easier. No, your life might be harder. But it's so worth it. David was hunted by Saul and his own son. At the beginning of his ministry, at the beginning of his reign, he was hunted by Saul. And at the end of his reign, he was hunted by his son. It's hard to follow Jesus. And these things happened because they trusted God and followed his commands, not because they didn't. There were things that happened because they didn't trust God. But many of the things that happened was because they did trust God. I think back to Pastor Dude, who raised 5 kids on a meager salary in a hard place for nearly 40 years. There's a lie in us pastors that I get caught believing sometimes. We wrongly believe that our serving in ministry somehow cushions us from struggle and leads us to blessing. So we get discouraged and we struggle when struggle comes and people leave and ministry hurts. It's really true of all of us, isn't it? But the reality of struggle and suffering is it's often what keeps us from faith and obedience. The idea, the possibility of struggle and suffering keeps us from obeying God, because if we do this, then maybe people will turn their backs on us. Maybe we won't have the financial means to do what we think we want to do. It keeps us also, though, from experiencing the grace and the love and the power and the presence and the provision of God in our lives. Don't you love those stories of how God has provided for people when they were faithful? And you think, well, what's keeping me from experiencing that same kind of provision, that same kind of power? Well, potentially it's a lack of faith. I think I can take the word potentially out of that and say it's a lack of faith. For the believers in this room, we say, I believe in God. But I don't know if I want to do that. I don't know if I want to talk to that person about Jesus. I don't know if I want to give to that thing. I don't know if I want to give up this idea and plan for my life and pursue this idea and plan for my life, because this idea and plan for my life keeps me from the things that the world says that's what's going to make you happy. See, in each of the examples given in chapter 11, the character of God was experienced in a real and personal and powerful way. They saw God do things that only He could do because they gave Him an opportunity to do those things. They saw God for who He really was, and it changed them. The names of God you see in the Old Testament all come out of a faith experience from the person that said, God, I trust you. And they fixed their eyes on the promises that he made them that were far greater than worldly comfort, security, and prosperity. And that leads us to our third thread. Each had to fix their hope on heavenly promises. There's this, the way that the passage is structured, it's almost like the author of Hebrews, and I do this sometimes, I've probably done it in this sermon. Like you start down a trail and you've got this focus, right? And he starts, he says the definition of faith, and then he says, and then there was creation, and then there was Abel, and there was Enoch, and there was Noah, and there was Abraham, and there was Sarah. And then it's almost like he's like, but I have to tell you about this real quick. And then in verse 13 through 16, he takes like an aside, and then he comes back to it in verse 7. Oh, by faith. Remember, I was talking about Abraham. By faith, Abraham, right? So it's almost like he takes an aside, and the aside is really profound. Listen to what the aside is. He says, these all died in faith. Now, he's just talking, right now, he's only mentioned like 4 people. And he's going to mention more. And so what most scholars believe is that this passage, it was like he got too excited and got ahead of his points, okay? I do that a lot. I've probably done it 10 times in this sermon already. But he got ahead of his points. And so really 13 through 16 should be at the end of the passage saying all of these. And he does do that a little bit. He kind of restates his purpose. But listen to what he says in verse 13 through 16. He says, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised. But listen, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desired a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. You see what he does there? He says all the people I'm mentioning in this chapter, they had their eyes fixed on something that wasn't tangibly something that you could touch and feel on this earth, but something that was promised to them that was far greater than anything they could pursue on this earth. Better than money, better than relationships, better than vacations at the beach or in the mountains, whatever you prefer. Better than all those things. A heavenly home prepared for them. And listen to what, I love that first verse. He says, they all died in faith, not having received the things promised. They never got to actually experience the things promised. Think about Abraham. He just had a son. He was supposed to be a father of nations. He just had a son. And then a grandson, but he never had any, he didn't ever see the nation. Think about Moses. Moses got to look over in the promised land, but he never got to go in it. Think about David. David was a great king. He had a great kingdom, but he never got to be the king like he's promised, and the one that would follow in his footsteps would be the king forever. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised. But listen, but having seen them and greeted them from afar. This is good stuff. See, they saw the promises from a distance. When he says them, having seen them, he's talking about the promises. Having seen them, having seen the promises from afar. A distance. It took upwards of 70 years for Noah to build the ark before the rain even started. You read that passage in Genesis. Rain had never fallen from the sky until the flood. And he's building an ark because there's a great rainstorm coming. They didn't know what a rainstorm meant. And he's building an ark, and it took him 70 years. He saw the promise from a distance. It took 30 plus years for God to begin to bring the promise to Abraham to fruition. He's 75 years old. When God comes to him and says, I'm going to make you the father of nations. And he's 100 years old before his wife even gets pregnant. And then God says, hey, listen, Isaac, take him up to the mountaintop and kill him. Offer him to me on the mountaintop. And at this point, he's probably 7, 8, 9 years old. And only after that circumstance do we see that Abraham, the thing that God promised, actually becomes something that Abraham says, yes, now I see it. But he saw it from a distance. It took more than 40 years. It took 40 years for God to lead Moses out of Midian, where his father-in-law, where he was working with his father, to bring the people out of Egypt. They saw the promise from a distance, and then it says that they greeted them from afar. Them is the promises. That word greeted is looked forward to with pleasure, is how it should be understood. So not only did they see them from afar, but they longed for them with a passionate desire. They longed for, with pleasure, those promises to be true. They didn't give in to doubt, give up on God, even though there were some weak moments. They persisted because they deemed what was promised worth the wait. Isn't that awesome? They said, I see it. I don't know if I'm ever going to see it like in fruition in its full form, but I see it, and I want to give my whole life to pursuing it because it's worth it. And it says, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. What does that mean? Well, it means they acknowledged that the promises weren't earthly blessings, but heavenly rewards, and that their home was not here. They understood that their lives from the perspective of the promise, not from the present situation. They didn't dwell on or fix their hope on earthly treasures or fleshly pleasures, but fixed their hope in heavenly promises. That's a good thing. Just write that down. I'm not taking credit for it. I'm just saying it's a powerful thing to think of. They did not dwell or fix their hope on earthly treasures or fleshly pleasures, but fixed their hope in heavenly promises. How much of your life is spent pouring yourself out on earthly treasures or fleshly pleasures? Colossians 3:1-4 says, if then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things on the earth, for you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. This is the hope that anchors and fuels our faith. It's the message of the great hymn, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. You remember that? Oh soul, you are weary and troubled. No light in the darkness you see. There's a light for a look at the Savior and life more abundant and free. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of this earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. His word shall not fail you, he promised. Believe him, and all will be well. Then go to a world that is dying, his perfect salvation to tell. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Turn your eyes on Jesus, who is the down payment and the guarantee of your heavenly reward. Here's the last thread. They all received, and I say a glorious reward, but I should say their glorious reward. Look at verse 39 and 40. All these were approved through their faith. And again, he says, but they did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us. What is the better for us? Jesus. What he's saying is, Jesus ultimately was the fulfillment of all the promises to Abel, to Noah, to Abraham and Moses and Enoch and Rahab and Gideon and all those that he lists. Samson, Barak, Jephthah, David, Samuel, the prophets, all of those. They didn't get the fulfillment of the promise. But here's what he says. Since God had provided for us something better, so that they would not be made perfect without us. And what he's saying there is, in our generation, as Christ came, they were perfected. They were made perfect. They were wholly satisfied in Jesus. They didn't get to meet Jesus on earth. They didn't get to experience his salvation he obtained through his blood in their lifetimes. But all the promises that God made to Abraham, Moses, Joshua, Samuel, David, Gideon, Rahab, and everyone else mentioned became reality for them in Jesus. Faith is hard because we can't always hold it and taste it and see it. But what we do have is the stories of those who have gone before us, who died not just with a vague hope that maybe there would be something good on the other side, but with a confident assurance that what they were promised would be there for them because they believed the one who told them. I've told you guys this story before, but outside of my grandpa's nursing home, just a few months before my grandmother passed away, we were standing in the parking lot, and I was telling her goodbye. We were about to head back here, and she was about to head back home, and she said, I need to tell you, I had a dream the other day about heaven. It was a funny, cute dream, but it was awesome. She said it was like I was sucked out of a balloon, and she said, I just felt weightless and without any worries that I could ever have in the world. Nothing bothered. It was just perfect. It was glorious. It was wonderful. She said it's like, and from that moment, she had that dream until the last breath that she took. She had this picture of heaven that I think God gave her. And the last years of her life they were sad years because she lost loved ones, and then she had to put her husband, who she had done such a good job of taking care of. He would have died long before that if she hadn't been there to take care of him. He was kind of helpless without her. But she had this picture of heaven, and all those years of struggle and pain and sadness and despair, they were so worth it. Because she had this hope in heaven that just satisfied her heart. I got to preach her funeral, and I got to share that message at her funeral, because the thing that was so powerful about that is that I knew that she had received the glorious promise that God had given her, that he showed her in that dream. Every one of us have a crisis of belief. And really, it's like a daily thing. Every one of us have this crisis of belief. Do you believe it? Do you believe this word? Is it worth pursuing? Of course, the answer is yes, but you have to make that decision for yourself. See, God wants us to take a step every day in his direction, through prayer, through praise, through pursuing him in his word, through submission, through surrender, and through obedience. But do you believe it? Is it worth it? Jesus encounters this rich young ruler, and the rich young ruler says, I've done everything that I know to do to get into heaven. What do I like? What's the last thing? And Jesus tells him, he says, you need to sell everything you have, all of your possessions, and give them to the poor. And he says, and to receive the treasure that I'm offering you. That's really the crisis of belief for all of us today. Do we believe the treasure Jesus is offering us is greater than the treasures that we can pursue and the pleasures that we can pursue on this earth? And if you deem the treasures of this earth to be better, then I don't think any of us can truly experience Jesus. I want to invite you to stand. If you're willing, if you're able, the band's going to come forward. You guys can go ahead and start making your way forward.